Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Karam. I'm the Executive Director of the Pipeline Safety Trust. As you are all very aware, today marks 25 years since the devastating Olympic pipeline tragedy stole the lives of Wade King, Stephen Tsiorvas, and Liam Wood. The Pipeline Safety Trust was formed in response to this completely avoidable criminal failure to improve the nation's pipeline safety and prevent other families from going through the senseless grief that Wade's, Stephen's, and Liam's families have had to endure. So we have a program this evening to try to remember the boys and help the community process grief and pass the story along to those who weren't here. But before we begin, I'd like to invite Daryl Hilaire up to share a few words.
Siam nostalgia Siam. Today we're putting our medicine together, and when we put our prayers together, that's medicine for the families. It's medicine for our community. It's a medicine for forgiveness. When we put our medicine together, it brings His Spirit into the room. And it's a spirit that's found in all living things. It's a spirit that's found in life. And it's our lives. And it's this moment that we call upon a person like Mahatma Gandhi, who asks if this power is benevolent or malevolent. And in this moment, we know that this power is benevolent, because in the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists. So therefore we gather that this power is life, truth, light. It is love. It is the supreme good. So we can all raise our hands to this moment, raise this hand of gratitude to each and every one of you for being here, for the families. Raise your hands for the love that you have in your hearts and your minds for what is healing. Raise your hands to the Creator for what is giving to all of us this life that we must carry on. And we give thanks to each and every one of you that are here tonight to bring your medicine, and give thanks to each other for standing up for what is good in our world, what is good in our life. So, Siam nostalgia Haishka.
Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, Daryl, I know it means a lot to the family members that you're here and to all of us. How many of you out here were here on June 10th, 1999? Yeah, a lot of you, but not all of us. I was not here in 1999. I moved here in 2020 to take over leadership of the Pipeline Safety Trust from Carl Weimer. Over the last week or so, we've hosted a series of events to honor the boys and remember that day. Along with our partners, the City of Bellingham, NC, Resources, and Whatcom Land Trust, we've offered a creek restoration project, a film and discussion at the Pickford Film Center, creek walks in the park, and an unveiling ceremony of new signage in the park near the water treatment plant. We're doing this, as I mentioned before, to help continue the community and the families process grief from that day 25 years ago, and to pass along the story to the so many of us, me and the rest of you in the audience who weren't there in 1999. Sadly, it's part of this community's DNA, and we need to make sure that the story doesn't get forgotten. I want to thank the City of Bellingham, who have been amazing through the planning of this remembrance. From the first phone call, there was never a, let me check with my boss, I'll get back to you. It was, what do you need? And you got it. We're in. Also want to thank Twin Sisters Creamery, Pure Bliss, Slice of Heaven Desserts for their donations of food earlier. As we remember Wade, Stephen, and Liam tonight, remember that, sadly, Bellingham was not the first pipeline tragedy, and it has been far from the last. But Bellingham is the only community that truly did something about it. I know when I was interviewing for this job, and I learned, as I learned about the tragedy and I learned about how the community responded to this tragedy, I said, I was living in Oregon at the time, and I said, that is a community I want to be a part of. And I'm so proud to be a part of it, and I hope you are all proud to be a part of this community as well. Next, we're going to show a video that Carl Weimer made some years ago. It's about 13 minutes long. And I want to offer a few warnings. One, the quality isn't the greatest, so bear with us on that. Two, it is quite emotional. I've watched it over a dozen times at this point, and it guts me every single time. And so have that in mind. Please, if it's too intense and overwhelming, feel free to step outside. Again, it's only 13 minutes. There are also the third is that some of the descriptions are a bit graphic, so for any kids, keep that in mind as well. It's early on in the film, but I think those are important details and important on that kind of lived experience for those of us who weren't here to really know what happened that day. We have many of the people featured in this video here in our audience today. And I want all of you to know that my heart goes out to you today, every day, but especially today on this anniversary. And let's start the film.
June 10, 1999 is a warm, clear Thursday in Bellingham, a small city of 70,000 on Washington's northwest coast. By late afternoon, kids are home from school, already eager for the start of summer. At 4:30 p.m., Bellingham's 911 center begins getting calls reporting a strong odor of gasoline. The smell is coming from a wooded recreation area called Whatcom Park.
A call came in for an odor investigation. It's a pretty routine call. So we went to the bridge at Iowa and Woburn. And our captain approached the creek and looked over into the creek, and I just saw his eyes get really wide. It was just basically a river of gasoline.
Police and firefighters rush to evacuate the area and locate the source of the leak. Then, with no warning, the gas vapor rising from the creek ignites.
911, there's a big smoke. The nearby is smoke.
Okay,
Smoke.
here, hold on.
Below, and yes, I'd like to report an explosion.
Okay.
Top of Alabama Hill.
911.
There's been an explosion.
Where's it at?
Down by, Seahome Village.
Hello, have you heard about the fire on Alabama Hill?
Yes, we have.
My power just went off and there was a big boom outside.
Right, we are on scene.
I was at the store and a customer came running in and said downtown Bellingham had just exploded.
A house along Whatcom Creek catches fire.
I heard the guy that was working on our house say, "Oh my God, look at the fire. Somebody's house is on fire." And I ran out to the front yard and I could feel the heat of the flames on my face.
My first reaction is, where's Wade?
10-year-old Wade King and his friend Stephen Tsiorvas were last seen headed down towards the creek.
One of the teenagers down at Stephen's house said he was out on the back trail.
The two severely burned boys had climbed up on their own from the creek. The teenagers carry them to the front yard just as Wade's father arrives.
Well, his hair was all burned off. His face was stretched. I remember looking at their hands and the skin was virtually dripping off their fingertips.
Wade's mother runs out of their house and down the street towards the boys.
Frank was in the yard and he said, go home. Wade's been burned.
I remember telling Mary, "Don't look at him."
He was all distorted looking. And he said, Mom, don't look.
You know, they seemed to be lucid. I never thought for a second that they were going to die.
Caught in traffic, Stephen's mother has a premonition that something is terribly wrong.
I had an awful, awful feeling about it. I had every intention of getting home as quickly as possible. And we were trying to call home, and we couldn't get through. And finally, our daughter got through and said, Stephen's burned. They're going to take him to the hospital.
Both boys are burned over 90% of their bodies. From the local hospital, they are airlifted to the Harborview Trauma Center in Seattle.
We got to the hospital in Harborview, and the doctor said they cannot survive. They have no skin.
Back in Bellingham, the fire continues to burn, and another mother is waiting for her son to return home. 18-year-old Liam Wood had graduated from high school the week before. He'd spent the afternoon doing what he loved best, fishing in the park.
I had expected Liam to be home because he was going to be cooking dinner for us that night, and I started calling his friends because I started to worry, and they were calling, not having any clue of what was going on, just trying to find him. And then I got in the car and I drove down and tried to find his car. At one point I had to stop to get gasoline, and when I was in paying for it, the cashier behind the counter was listening to the radio, and I said, "Is there any news?" And he said, "Well, they found a body." And then I really started to panic, and I went home and I turned on the radio and they didn't mention it again, and I thought it must have been a mistake.
A search and rescue team recovers a body from the creek. But it is not until after midnight that the body is positively identified.
Around 2:30 in the morning, we heard steps on the porch, and well, at first I thought it was him, and it was the police. So they told us then.
At Harborview Hospital, the two boys cling to life as their families stand vigil by their bedside.
You couldn't touch him. You couldn't comfort him. There was nothing we could do but stand there and wait for him to die.
My son loved baseball, and I didn't want him to suffer. So I told him there's a baseball game going on in heaven, and they needed a left-handed hitting catcher.
Wade dies at just after 2 a.m. Stephen dies 5 hours later. In the days following the explosion, the town of Bellingham mourns its loss.
Liam felt at home in places like this. Places like this were his sanctuary.
It was just this incredible shock and this immediate sense of irony that someone who loved the environment, loved the outdoors so much, could be killed by something like a gasoline pipeline explosion in that place.
I remember waking up the next morning and thinking, who would have ever thought that you'd be planning your son's funeral this weekend?
And these boys, all three of them, were so much a part of this town. Everyone was shocked, absolutely shocked. We had no idea that there was a pipeline going through our community.
Olympic Pipeline sends representatives to Bellingham to reassure the town that the company itself is doing everything it can.
Right after the pipeline explosion, one of the first meetings Olympic had with the community, they came in and their PR people were sitting at tables and they were giving out these little Olympic Pipeline first aid kits. And here they've just blown up the town and killed people, and the one thing they're giving away is, 2 aspirin and a couple of Band-Aids.
Less than a month after the accident, the company announces plans to repair and reopen the pipeline as soon as possible. The town's reaction is immediate.
That was one of the most outrageous and ridiculous requests that I've ever heard in 17 years in public life.
Every living thing in the creek had been killed. And Olympic Pipeline was already talking about putting the pipe back in the ground and getting it going again before anybody had any clue why the thing had exploded.
Weimer and other concerned citizens begin a grassroots effort to stop the pipeline from reopening.
The citizens of Bellingham really stood up to say, no, you're not going to start that pipeline. There was a petition drive that had 5,000 or 6,000 signatures on it.
But what the town doesn't realize is that petitions and protests don't matter. Throughout the United States, local and state governments have next to no legal authority over the pipelines. To stop them, the people of Bellingham begin learning everything they can about pipelines. What they discover stuns them.
We didn't know anything about pipelines at all, and we were real surprised to find out accidents like this were not really anomalies. They happen quite frequently.
There are 2 million miles of liquid and natural gas pipelines in the United States. In the last decade, spills and ruptures occurred at a rate of nearly 1 a day. Dozens of tragedies like Bellingham's had happened throughout the country, but few of them got national attention.
You would assume that a pipeline running through a community that has the ability to cause such a huge tragedy would be fairly heavily regulated. And that may be true with some industries, but when we looked at pipelines, that wasn't true at all.
There were no national regulations requiring pipelines to be internally inspected. No regulations requiring leak detection systems. And there were no set standards for training pipeline employees. To make matters worse, local and state governments had no authority to do anything about the problem. That power rested exclusively in the hands of a tiny federal agency called the OPS, or Office of Pipeline Safety. The experiences of the last year have only strengthened their resolve to prevent this tragedy from happening somewhere else.
I think it's time for us to assert our right and our responsibility as citizens to say, we need to think about the health and the safety of our children and of our teachers and of our parents and grandparents and our environment before we think about pipeline profits.
Really, the only way to make this pipeline safe again and at the same time make other pipelines and other communities safe was to get regulations changed at the national level.
They take their message to any government agency that will listen. Their efforts eventually lead them to Washington, D.C. to speak before Congress.
The pipeline industry will never have as its bottom line the health and safety of communities. It is up to communities themselves and therefore their public representatives and government agencies to ensure that pipelines are safe. We would have to pay our way to Washington, D.C., and we would try to give our input, and we would have the ability to speak in front of the Senate, which was incredible for us. But what we'd realized was that there were 1 or 2 of us citizens in a room who knew nothing about pipelines, and we were surrounded by pipeline corporate CEOs and lobbyists who knew everything about it, who were there every day, who were being paid an enormous amount of money to influence politicians and being enormously successful at it.
We were naive at that point that this was such a no-brainer when you looked at the lack of legislation and the lack of regulations that the Congress would just go along with us. So I don't think we knew what we were getting ourselves into.
Despite the overwhelming odds, people in power are starting to listen. Even the pipeline industry itself begins to realize that things need to change.
Bellingham is just one of those events that comes along from time to time, regretfully, where a safety situation has been ignored for so long that finally, all of the warts of the system are brought together in one horrible, horrible moment.
In December 2002, a new Federal Pipeline Safety Act is signed into law. It mandates that pipelines be inspected every 7 years, sets rigorous training standards for pipeline employees, raises fines, and offers protection for industry whistleblowers.
I think that the American public owes a great deal to the citizens of Bellingham. They were no longer a voice crying in the wilderness. It was, they went and basically have changed the wilderness.
Next I would like to invite the person responsible for creating that video, the founding executive director and the current special projects advisor of the Pipeline Safety Trust, not to mention the former executive director of resources, county council chair, former county council chair, Carl Weimer. In many ways, Carl became the vessel through which the community's anger and desire for change was funneled after the explosion. And I'm not sure if anyone knew exactly how singular of a force they had on their hands with Carl. Not only is Bellingham lucky to have Carl, but every community living near a pipeline is lucky to have Carl.
I brought my good friend Godzilla with me here, and I'll explain that in a second. I lost my notes somewhere earlier, so we'll see how this goes. I just want to thank everybody for coming out. One of the take-home messages of the Bellingham tragedy that is so unique when you compare it to other tragedies, and since I've been involved with pipelines for 25 years now, I've lived through lots of other tragedies, is the way the city of Bellingham and the citizens and our local government and leaders came together, joined forces, and said no to the pipeline company. Within a couple of weeks of the explosion, they were going to put the pipeline back in the ground and get it going again, even though they had no idea how it had failed. And the citizens of Bellingham said, no, that's not going to happen. A group called Safe Bellingham was formed. It was an offshoot of resources where citizens got together and started pushing back to the pipeline company. The city of Bellingham did a wonderful job. They had some leverage because of a franchise agreement. Mayor Osmundson was strong in that. Our congressional delegation, both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, joined forces for pipeline safety. So the community lifted everyone up. And I think the main reason that worked so well is because the three families, it was amazing to watch. I was an insider and got to see it, stayed strong. What I've seen in one community after another, it's very easy for a family to go into their grief and let someone else do the talking. And if that someone doing a talking is a politician or a safety official, they get busy with other things. These families stayed strong, kept this in the media, and really, lifted up this community. So it was nice that a while later, the community could help take over and help those families move forward. Early on, one of the families, I think all three of them embraced it, went to bat for the idea of creating a national watchdog organization. You know, as they talked to the U.S. Justice Department as they prosecuted this case, and it was the only pipeline case up to that point where pipeline employees went to jail. But the families decided they wanted a national watchdog organization to keep an eye on both the pipeline industry and the pipeline regulators. And the Justice Department, as they started prosecuting this, was so aghast at the way the pipeline company had failed on multiple levels to fix things that could have prevented this tragedy, and that the regulators hadn't caught any of those things, that they joined with those families on the idea of creating a national watchdog. So when the case settled in 2003, $4 million was awarded to create the Pipeline Safety Trust. And on the day that that award happened, the federal judge, we didn't make this up, the federal judge was the one that made it up, compared the Pipeline Safety Trust as Bambi versus Godzilla. Godzilla, the oil industry, Bambi, the Pipeline Safety Trust. And we've kind of embraced that ever since. So I'm going to tell you some not very often told stories. People in this room probably don't know that. It's kind of a report back to the community of some of the things we've been up to in the last 25 years that you probably haven't heard about. I used to carry Bambi around with me. And I get called all the time to go to places. Early on, we didn't spend much time here in Washington State because the state legislature, the state utilities and transportation commissions stepped up. We probably had the safest pipelines of anywhere in the country. All of our focus was in Washington, D.C. So spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. I don't know how many times I've testified to Congress. Congressman Larson is here today. I've testified to his committee a few times. There's these little inside stories of how nimble and how the industry thinks that Bambi is everywhere at once. I remember one time testifying to his committee, and he came down off the dais before this started, and I'm surrounded by 50 pipeline executives and lobbyists, and Mr. Larson comes down and shakes my hand and puts his hand on my shoulder and acts like I'm his close chum. And if you've ever been to Congress, there's little rooms off the back side behind the dais where the Congress people come and go, and it's like, what goes on in there? It's some kind of weird secret room. And he takes me by the arm and he leads me back there, and I get to go through the secret door and see what's behind the dais, which wasn't very exciting really. But when I came back out, I looked, and here's all these oil company lobbyists with me, with a high-ranking, I don't think you were the chairman at that point, but you were pretty close, with his arm around me, and it was like, oh God, Bambi just got bigger. Got a call not long after that from a small town in Nebraska. There's this pipeline coming through. I think they're calling it Keystone. This wasn't the Keystone everybody was fighting about. That was Keystone XL. This was Keystone 1. And the League of Women Voters in this small town of about 300 people said, would you like to come and talk to a gymnasium full of angry landowners? And I was like, oh yeah, sign me up for that. Went to Nebraska, listened to their story, and explained to them, this company can use eminent domain to take your property to put this pipeline through. And they didn't have a solution to that, but the Pipeline Safety Trust hired a lawyer from the University of Nebraska to meet with all those landowners in a closed-door session to explain to them how that law works and to see if they wanted counsel. Later, got called to Fort Worth, Texas. Would you like to come talk to an auditorium full of angry people? The industry is putting 400 miles of new pipelines all over downtown Fort Worth, Texas. Sure, sign me up for that. That sounds like a picnic. And we went and did that, and the city council then passed regulations governing the use of gathering lines within the city of Fort Worth. The most interesting story I had, I think, because it reflected so much on what happened here in Bellingham, is there was a spill in Salt Lake City, actually two. Chevron dumped oil into a creek that runs right through the middle of Salt Lake City, once in June and then again in November or December of the same year. Very similar to Bellingham. It didn't catch fire, but crude oil ruining a park in the middle of their city. And the mayor of Salt Lake had heard about the Pipeline Safety Trust. He invited us to come and speak there. to see if he could learn things about how we had organized in Bellingham that they could organize Salt Lake. And I got into the mayor's conference room, which is a really fancy room, and I thought it was going to be, you know, myself and a couple of his aides or something, and I get there, and it's the mayor, it's the governor, it's a bunch of legislators, a room full of about 15 or 20 high-ranking folks. And about the time they were ready to listen to whatever I had to say, they got a phone call and said, oh, the Federal Office of Pipeline Safety just approved Chevron to turn that pipeline back on, even though they don't know why it leaked. They're turning it on tomorrow, and oh man, between the governor and the mayor, it was hard to tell who was the most angry. And they'd been calling for 2 days, and no one at Office of Pipeline Safety would answer their calls. They didn't know how to get through. They didn't know who to talk to, and they were mad, and the federal government wasn't talking to them. Well, I happened to know the administrator of the Office of Pipeline Safety, and I had his personal cell phone number. And I pulled out my cell phone and I said, would you like to talk to the administrator? And I dialed it and handed it to the mayor, and almost lost that friendship with Office of Pipeline Safety. But they did communicate then, and they gave them 3 more days to try to figure this out and do their own PR. So the Pipeline Safety Trust has been all over the place doing all kinds of things, Bambi versus Godzilla, and just wanted to report that back to the community. The other take-home message is not only have we changed federal regulations, it's incremental change a little bit all the time. The biggest change came right after Bellingham. There was no rule at the time the Bellingham failure happened that if you put a pipeline in the ground, you ever had to inspect it again. That changed in 2002 when they first passed some pipeline integrity management that requires that. But there's been incremental change every 4 or 5 years since then, and it's frustrating and it's slow and citizens get really annoyed with it. But if you look at incremental change over 25 years, it makes things quite a bit safer. So that's kind of what the Pipeline Safety Trust has been doing on the pipeline side. Other things that the community doesn't realize about is what a touchstone pipeline of Bellingham has become for the pipeline regulators in the industry around the country. I do tours of Whatcom Creek and where the explosion happened all the time, and it's usually for industry groups. The Association of Oil Pipelines sends a group. The Interstate Natural Gas Association sends a group. You know, a big oil company will send a group. Last group that was here was the National Transportation Safety Board. All of their inspectors came and walked the creek and heard that and then reevaluated how they had investigated that. There's a big oil company based out of Ohio. Every member of their staff, when they start, has to watch a movie like this. They make them watch the Bellingham story, and they often come out here and then hear it directly. So, you know, I've become friends with people in the industry. Bambi and Godzilla actually get along sometimes and have those connections. And to some degree, we've wiggled our way into the industry and changed things culturally wise there. And finally, I just want to leave it with, there's still things to be done. Last year was the worst year for deaths from pipelines in about a decade. So there's more rules that need to happen. There's new types of pipelines coming online, CO2 pipelines, hydrogen in pipelines. The rules aren't very strong on those yet. They need to be strengthened. And there's lots of things that local citizens can do. You know, I've always thought that one of the reasons that Bellingham is so progressive when it comes to energy issues, both the city and the county have climate action committees working on how we can reduce transportation, reduce the use of the fuels that flow through pipelines. I think part of that comes out of the Bellingham tragedy, that we're so active in those things. And those things all need to be reinvigorated right now. We need to double down. But our comp plans are being renewed this year. There's utility chapters that talk about pipelines. There's climate chapters that talk about what we can do to drive less. Citizens like all of you sitting here can get involved in being impactful in those discussions. One of the things the state did after the pipeline tragedy was they not only took over inspection authority from the federal government, they also formed a citizen committee on pipeline safety. It's the only state utility commission in the country that has such a citizen involvement committee where you get to talk about the rules and regs within the state. That committee was very active for the first 10 years, and of late they go begging to try to get citizens on that committee to pay any attention. There's a sign-up sheet out there, I think, that talks about the Citizen Committee on Pipeline Safety, and we need more citizens on that. We certainly need local government officials on that, and we need to force the industry to come back and sit down at that table too. So those are some things that we can all continue to do. There's much more to do as we think about climate change and how pipelines may enable climate change. So I just want to have you take that home with you and think about your part in it, because as this community has raised up to stop this pipeline, we can also make big changes around here on the way energy is plumbed in this country. I think that's about all I have to say, other than thank you again for showing up. We really appreciate that. You know, the community has lifted me up, and as I ran around with Bambi shooting my mouth off in places all over the country, it was because I thought of the parents that I had to testify next to and got to know really well, and how much this community cared about that. And that's what gave me OCD and got me going on all this pipeline stuff. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, next we're going to hear a song from Linda Allen called Pipeline. Linda wrote this song in the days after the explosion, and she performed this at the 10-year anniversary as well.
Well, I remember that day very well. I saw this cloud from our house on Utter Street, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Wonder what's happened. And I went to the backyard with my son, who was then about 5, and all of a sudden, as I was watching it just get bigger and bigger, I suddenly got truly terrified. It's like, what is in that? And I ran inside with my son, and I closed all the windows and doors and just waited. What happened? And watched the news. So I'm sure I wasn't alone on that. It was a terrifying day. So a little after that, I wrote this song. We remember how it started. Flames of snow, smoke, and fire that grew and grew. We knew a dreadful thing had happened. We grabbed our kids and waited for the news. A pipeline can demand an awful price. For whose convenience did we sacrifice? We remember 3 young boys who died in the sweet lands and the waters where they played. We will not sacrifice our children, will not sacrifice our lands. We'll remember that sad day. We'll hold each other's hands. We will shout into the sky till we're weary of the sound. Only we will choose what's buried underneath our town. We believed our homes were sacred, never noticed that the pipes were made. We believed all that they told us. We believed until that awful day. Now we believe that it is up to us. There are those we know we cannot trust. We believe we put our children first, and the sweet lands and the waters where they play. We will not sacrifice our children, we'll not sacrifice our lands. We'll remember that sad day. We'll hold each other's hands. We'll hold each other's hands. We will shout it to the sky, till they're weary of the sound. Only we will choose what's buried underneath our town. We will not sacrifice our children, sacrifice our lands. We'll remember that sad day. We'll hold each other's hands. We will shout it to the sky, till they're weary of the sound. Only we will choose what's buried underneath our town. We remember how it started.
Thank you, Linda. That was beautiful. Next, we are going to hear from our mayor, Mayor Kim Lund. Mayor Lund was at the sign unveiling in the park today, and I was really moved by the story she shared, and I'm so glad she's here to share her leadership with us tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm often invited to speak at events in our community because of my position, and it isn't always the case that you have a deeply personal connection to what you're invited to speak about. But this is one of those events, and I had the opportunity this afternoon to share my reflections of growing up in Bellingham. I grew up on Alabama Hill, and for us, Whatcom Falls Park was the central meeting spot for all the children in our neighborhood, even the Geneva neighborhood. Toledo Hill, we'd all ride our bikes and converge in the park, and we'd spend hours jumping off the cliffs in the whirlpool, fishing for crawdads. We often used just string and washers, and hot dogs were good bait, actually. And we would come out, like as a child in the 70s and 80s, you left your home in the morning and you knew did not come home till dinner time. And so we would often pop up out of the park, and the street along St. Clair and Iowa Drive was often where we would go for lunch or for popsicles. And Wade's older brother, Jason, was one of the families that lived on Iowa Drive. And so it would be Mary or some of the other moms that were taking care of us when we'd come in, and then we'd go back into the park. So I grew up with the fondest of memories. And what resonated in the film that we saw is Liam's mom used the word sanctuary, and that's really what Whatcom Falls Park was. In those days, growing up in this community, Whatcom Falls Park was our sanctuary. It was a place to be deep in nature, and it was also where it was home away from home, and it was safety. And as a child, the way a child mind works, if I was ever feeling like scared in my bedroom as a little girl, I would often think, well, if the bad man comes, I'm going to find safety in Whatcom Falls Park because I know every inch of that park and no one could find me there. I was certain I could find the ultimate hiding spot in that park. And so fast forward many years, I'm in Oregon and starting my professional career, and I got the phone call from a friend who'd spent many of those summer afternoons with me, and he said, Whatcom Falls Park is gone. And I couldn't really comprehend what that meant. And we both shared the reflection, wow, that could have been us. And we didn't know whose lives had been taken that day and what the personal toll is for the families that were impacted and for this community. And so it's an honor and a privilege to be here now, speaking and honoring the human toll, the toll of what happened to the environment in the park that day, but also reflecting on all the hard work, the way, the confluence of events that have led to all the good work that has unfolded since then, and the national scale of impacts that this community has helped galvanize. And it's an honor to be mayor speaking here, but I think it's more important that I yield the rest of my time to former Mayor Mark Osmondson. He was the leader of the city during that time, and he made so many important decisions. He committed to not holding the line and not letting that pipeline reopen when they wanted to. And he directed the city legal for years to be involved in this process and committed to it, and was instrumental when that $12 million award came out, putting that $4 million seed money to create the Pipeline Safety Trust. And I'm grateful for his leadership, and I'd like to invite Mark to take the stage.
I'll try to bounce up here. Odd to speak to you in this context. Frank and Mary, Marlene, Bruce, Catherine, Skip, horror that may not be with you every second of your life, but will never go away. The most consequential thing about this tragedy is the impact on the families, the relief probably on the part of the families whose children regularly played in the park, but the fear engendered and the way they could identify with the unbelievable losses, the losses experienced by our families. Bellingham is a unique community. Like Mary Lund, I was born in Bellingham. I've seen it change a lot, but one of the things that has not changed is that we are a community that is supportive of being the best that we can be. And while I was mayor and could only be involved in a responsive role, not a proactive, preventive role regarding this horrible tragedy, I was honored to have such wonderful people at the city, like Don Keenan, who was my chief administrative officer, who led the effort at the onset because I was out of country when the pipeline exploded, to ensure that the city of Bellingham was at the table, that all of the department heads, the fire department, the public works department, the police department, were fully integrated and involved, that the emergency response team, Don, insisted with the full support of Pat Rowe, Mayor Pro Tem, and the City Council, that the City of Bellingham play an integral role and be part of the management team of the emergency response, which was unheard of. Bellingham as a community, the parents, despite their horror, the awful suffering, they steadfastly worked together with Congress, Senator Murray, even Senator Gorton, even Representative Jack Metcalf, Congressman Larson's predecessor, were all supportive of doing everything that they could, which in Metcalf's case wasn't much, but in the Senate, it was actually essential that Senator Gorton be on our side, and he was from day one because it was a Republican Senate at that time. And Senator Murray was absolutely instrumental all the way through, from the moment we started, about 8 days after the event, our first lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. until the ultimate outcome. The Pipeline Safety Trust, the predecessor Safe Bellingham, and all the community, and most particularly the suffering families who cared more about protecting people all around this country than they cared about just simply grieving, which is a place most people would expect they would go. The pipeline company anticipated opening this pipeline in such a short time. And the only reason, as Carl mentioned earlier, it's federally regulated. There's no state authority. There is now some state authority, but there was no local authority. But the pipeline company was not only inept in their operation of the pipeline, they failed to renew the franchise to utilize City of Bellingham property for the pipeline, which allowed us to exert great pressure on them. And this pipeline was closed down longer than any liquid fuel pipeline in the country. And I believe it was 8 or 9 months, we were required that they do hydro testing of the pipeline, which revealed another leak. The pipe burst just south of the middle school, Colshan Middle School on Lakeway Drive. We didn't do everything that should have been done. We did what we could. I'm going to end with a statistic and not a poem. And the statistic is actually bad news. That pipeline existed, and that there was an unbelievable regulatory failure, which it's better now than it was then. But the reason the pipeline existed, and the reason that rail cars are now falling off railroad tracks and blowing up cities, is because we drive. In 1999, in the United States, we drove 2.63 trillion miles. In 2023, we drove 3.19 trillion miles. And that number is lower than it would have been because there was a significant drop during the pandemic, and employers discovered that they could get their employees to use their homes as an office space instead of paying rent. Last statistic, I promise. In 1999, in the United States, 8,431 barrels, 42 gallons per barrel, of gasoline was sold. 2023, 8,944, despite the significant dip because of the pandemic, the reduction in commuting, and the advent of electric cars. We are driving ourselves into an overheated planet, and we drive ourselves into tragedies like this. Bellingham isn't doing it, but as a society, until we give up petroleum as the cornerstone of our transportation methodology, these things will continue to happen. Mary and Frank, Marlene and Bruce, Catherine, Skip, I can't imagine, even to this day, how you have suffered, and your loss will never, ever go away. But I salute you all, and thank you for what you've given, not just to Bellingham, but to communities around the country. And I will now do what I forgot to do. I would really like to introduce Representative Rick Larson, who at the time of this explosion had the Olympic pipeline going through his jurisdiction as a county council member, I believe, in Snohomish County, and who very shortly thereafter, I think in the year 2000, when were you elected? Was it 2000, 2001? 2000, was elected to the House of Representatives and was, again, an ardent supporter of the Pipeline Safety Act, Revision Act, Improvement Act of 2002 and subsequent pipeline legislation. He's been a wonderful representative for our community since 2000. And welcome, Congressman.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And you can tell my hair's a lot grayer. It's the same haircut I had since 2000, but my hair's a bit grayer. But I want to thank Bill and the Pipeline Safety Trust, the City of Bellingham, Resources, the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association, and the Land Trust for hosting tonight's commemoration and the events of the last week as well. To the Mayor and Mayor Lund and Carl and Bill, again, thank you for sharing. And to Daryl, or Daryl went for your moving prayer, and to Linda for your song. Every day is, I know it's hard for the families of Liam and Wade and Stephen, the young victims who went to Walking Falls Park like a lot of kids in Bellingham did for a long time. On that day, as they'd done many times before. And so my deepest condolences really to the families and your loved ones as well. Today's though another reminder of the strength and resilience of the city of Bellingham in the face of that horrible day 25 years ago. For me, June 10th, 1999 started as an ordinary spring day. I was on the county council, as Mark mentioned, and I was in Seattle for some reason. But I was traveling northbound on I-5, just north of Seattle when the news broke. When the news broke, not much was very clear, obviously. But the costs became very clear quickly thereafter, in lives lost, and the environmental damage, the property damage, and the trauma to this community. The pictures and eyewitness accounts from residents and first responders still tell a very harrowing story, as we saw in the video. But that day spurred my commitment and other people's commitment, which has been steadfast for 25 years, to the highest level of pipeline safety that I can get out of Congress. I was elected to serve as a member member of Congress of the House, representing Bellingham in November of 2000. And I think in the next week, 10 days after that election, I was in DC for orientation. And I was invited by Jim Hall, actually, the chair of the NTSB, to go to their hearing. They were having another hearing on the report on pipeline safety. And I remember walking in I had a green suit, a little off-green suit, very baggy at the time, very, very 2000s in terms of style. And I mentioned the color green because the rest of the room was full of people in black and blue, dark blue suits with starched white shirts and very, very strong ties. Basically a room full of lobbyists at the NTSB hearing. And then Jim introduced me just said I was there, and I got a lot of people turning around and looking at this new member of Congress from Bellingham, Washington. And that was sort of my introduction to at least what I was going to have to put up with. But it was very clear to me, and still clear, that the strength of this community was going to help me be strong in Congress. The community's strength provided me the strength to act and keep acting. Your input, as has been noted, has influenced pipeline safety nationwide. With the help of moving testimony and advocacy from victims' families, and from Safe Bellingham at the time. I was reading this speech, reviewing this. This is at the turn of the century. And it's like it was 125 years ago. I guess we can talk about the turn of the century. It's been that long, but you've been at it that long, and soon enough, 2 years later or so, a little less than that, Congress passed and President Bush signed into law the Bipartisan Pipeline Safety Act of December, and he signed it in December 2002. Your stories and testimony injected humanity into this legislative process. That is often lacking still in Washington, D.C. But humanity has, I've tried to make humanity an integral part of that story every time we re-up the pipeline safety bill. And I always get a chance for an opening statement, and I always go back and review what happened in 1999 for the committee members, so they understand that I'm just not doing this because it's a fun thing to do, or I like to stick it to the pipeline companies. Like, this has real impacts on people's lives if we do the right thing, and the folks need to know that. And many thanks to the personal testimony of family members who've come to Congress to testify, and from Carl as well, and Bill most recently. But because of that testimony and because of the past efforts, Congress is now working on bipartisan legislation to build on the Pipeline Safety Act of 2002 and 2006 and the Pipes Act and so on. And we passed a bill out of our committee in December of last year, and we're waiting on a few other committees to get their work done as well, including changes to how we regulate hydrogen pipelines and CO2 pipelines as well. But as Bill noted in his testimony before my committee last month, Congress has a long way to go to get to zero pipeline safety incidents. But the best way to cut through that noise in DC and get Congress to pay attention is to continue to tell your stories. They have to be part of sometimes they're hard to tell, but they have to be part of what Congress hears as we move forward on these issues. I'll say it again a different way, but you all bring the voice of humanity to what would otherwise be just another policy debate, and we need to hear that voice of humanity. It's important that we hear that. The community chooses to remember this day in many ways, through gatherings like this, through quiet prayer or song, through a memorial walk or a habitat restoration project at the park, or through fly fishing, enjoying the outdoors as Liam, Wade, and Stephen would. Each remembrance holds a purpose, it holds meaning, it holds strength, and it is this community's strength, that provides the moral compass for continued action on pipeline safety, and I want to thank you for that. Without it, we wouldn't be where we are. We'd be far behind where we were. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to thank you again for inviting me this evening to be part of remembering. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Representative Larson. It's been a real pleasure working with you and your staff as ranking member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and having a real national leader on pipeline safety represent us here in Bellingham. Next, we're going to have another music break. We're going to hear from Swolcanum. He was also performed at previous memorials of this tragedy and for the boys. We're lucky to have him back now. He's an award-winning violinist, native storyteller, and Lummi Nation elder. Please join me in welcoming Swolcanum.
Thank you. Is Daryl here still? Did Daryl leave? Oh, darn, I was going to talk about him. I guess I won't do that, no. I was adopted away from the Lummi tribe. I was raised in privilege on Alabama Hill, Crestline Drive, big view of the city. I was told I was less than because I'm Indian, that I wasn't smart enough to play the violin, so they wouldn't sign the parent permission slip. My fourth grade teacher, Kathy Dorr, my hero, she forged the parent permission slip, which allowed me to play the violin. I served in the Army after graduating from Seaholm High School, came back home, and I knew enough to spend time with my elders, to ask them the questions. And I remember many times, especially on Saturday mornings, I'd go in and I'd talk to my Uncle Art Lane, Similano. And I'd ask him questions like, what are we going to do about all these white people? And he'd say, don't worry about the white people. And I said, okay. Then he'd say, we had everything before money came. I said, don't you mean white people? And he said, no, money came first. It affected our agreements with our neighboring family members and tribes. We started arguing amongst each other over harvesting and taking too much for the sake of money so they could buy things that were good for their family, tools. So money came before white people did. And then I began to ask him other questions. And I remember it was usually during basketball games, and he was giving me answers to one of these questions. And I said, oh, you know, Uncle, I really want to hear what you have to say, but Whitney Houston's about to sing during the halftime or something, or during and he goes, Whitney who? And I said, Whitney Houston. She's the most beautiful woman in the world, and she sings this most amazing song about the children. The children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. And he goes, so she's beautiful, talented, and a liar? I was, Uncle. He goes, the children are not our future. We don't put the burden of the future on children. That's our job as elders. It's my words that you will remember in the future. I stand here today sharing with you the words of my elders. This is the future of that day. That day we'll never forget. If you weren't here, you'll always hear about it. So I offer this notion. What about the future? It is our responsibility to hold the future up for the children. As elders, it's our responsibility to make the essential changes in the world. I offer this because I know that's what you're doing. I already recognize that that is what you are doing. And I can't not say this one thing. You, just by sitting in this room, are an answer to my ancestors' prayers. That you care about our well-being, about the future. It touches me in a beautiful way. It heals the wounds in my heart from my childhood. It gives me hope. In the Lummi language, someone held in high esteem is called CM. We raise our hands when we acknowledge a CM. Haishka CM. That's thank you, friend held in high esteem. That's Chalaka CM, family. We're related to the moment. We are family in our own way. We talk about the spirit of Whatcom Creek. I want to share something with you that's really important to me. The noise of Whatcom Creek taught me to listen, to hear, to answer a higher calling within me. It's still doing the same for each and every single one of us. This is a piece I wrote in honor of every CM here. It's called CM.
I heard that at sound check earlier and wasn't sure how I would keep myself composed to come up here after, but here I am. So from here, I want to open it up if there are any family members in the audience that would like to share something. You are free to do that now. You can come up here, you can raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Skip?
Good evening. I don't usually speak at events like this, but this one means a lot to me. I remember a lot about the actual day, and in some ways, to me, it still seems like yesterday. In other ways, it seems like forever. 1 year, 10 years, 25 years. And one thing that I've come to understand in my lifetime is that in the pressure of an immediate moment like this, the path forward is not always clear at the moment. But as time moves on and events transpire, that path becomes very much clearer. And our role in making progress begins to surface. In this instance, that role was to make sure that another tragedy like this didn't happen again, and keeping our community safe from the negligence that made this tragedy happen. This community came together, which we've heard from various speakers, and not only wrapped their arms around us all to make sure that our families were taken care of in this time of grief and shock, but further also took a stand and accomplished things that had never taken place in our country. As you've heard, we shut the pipeline down for an extended period of time until the failures of this pipeline were corrected and guaranteed to never happen again. Not just in Bellingham, but this pipeline runs all the way down to Portland. So throughout the whole state of Washington. And as you've heard, other communities have these same events. And after, as Carl said, after a couple of news cycles, it's life is normal, life goes on, and that didn't happen here. Our work led to the development of the Pipeline Safety Trust, which was an independent watchdog group for the pipeline industry. Unprecedented, but necessary. And the funding for this happened through the judicial process against Olympic Pipeline with broad support of you, our citizens, many layers of government, including the city of Bellingham. And thank you, Mark, for making that happen. I remember the conversations you and I had back then about some of these dynamics and things. Funding for something like this happened for the first time, and it hasn't happened since. I remember meeting some people at the first pipeline conference in New Orleans who were employees of some pipeline companies in other states who offered their condolences to me personally. I didn't even think they'd know who I was. And they also expressed to me directly their feeling that something like the PST was needed. Now, I don't know how far up the corporate ladder they were, but when they said that and I listened, I soon realized through those brief discussions how unregulated this industry really was. And no outside oversight was in place. And because of the Pipeline Safety Trust, I believe it's now recognized worldwide as an expert in some of these areas of pipeline safety. This community, as a response to this horrendous tragedy, with their strength and endurance, made this happen. And as time goes by, it's easy to let these memories fade, but we can't forget that through our strength and the strength of our community that we persevered through the immediate shock, looked at the long term, and saw what needed to be done. And in so doing, made the world a little better and a safer place to live. For that, this is something we, and I mean all of you who are here tonight, as well as the rest of our community, this is something that we can be proud of. And I and my family, as community members that were severely impacted by this tragedy, are eternally grateful for that. And we will always remember that day and what followed as a result. And so thank you very much for all of that.
Are there any other family members interested in saying a few words? We can bring a mic to you. Are there any friends of the boys, of Wade's, Liam, Stephen, that want to share some memories? Or first responders? I'd like to share. Please, come on up.
How's it going, everybody? My name is Tyrone Francisco. I've been here for a minute, but I've had the opportunity to leave and bring love with me. And I do want to say, first of all, thank you all for coming. It means a great deal to me. I had, excuse me, I was struggling for a long time, and I met a few religious figures, and they didn't really help. Talked to some scientific folk. They didn't really help. But when I was traveling to New Orleans, I found this old cat on a bench at a retirement home when I was doing my medic stint out there. And I had a question. Why do all the good ones leave first? Why are they always taken? And he told me, you never see the Lord take a wilted flower. He always picks the beautiful ones, the ones that are fresh. And that's stuck with me for a very long time. But there's a whole lot more work to be done. And I hope that everyone here takes a minute, just reflects, and just understands how much has been done so far, and that there's a lot more left to do. And myself, I'm a subsea engineer, and I'm an oil and gas consultant. And I've traveled the world to make sure that this does not happen ever again. And I've been working, I was actually just at the Martinez refinery over there by San Francisco over the weekend, doing some inspections. And I'll say that even though we are a very small town, a very small community, we have spoken and a lot of folk have listened. There's a lot of changes that have happened for the better. And I just want to say, thank you all. Your guys' voice matters. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming up right about 8 o'clock, so unless there's somebody with a, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andy Snow. I'm a science teacher at Whatcom Community College. And I just wanted to share a couple personal anecdotes about Liam Wood. I was in graduate school in Corvallis back in the early 90s. And I met Marlene and Liam at one of those summer concerts out in the park. And we ended up dating and living together. And I remember at that dance, having fun. It was a summer day. And then feeling a tug on my shirt. And this little boy, this cute little kid, wanted my attention. He was holding this big old earthworm. And he wanted us to save it. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty cool kid. And he was so concerned because the dancing was making all the earthworms come out of the ground. And he was kind of freaking out that we were dancing on them. And that it's just testimony to what Liam was like. He was a wonderful, kind, really mellow young man. And I remember living with him. He loved to sit in this big Papadon chair and read and laugh. And it was really a nice time. Another little story, one time all three of us were hiking in Opal Creek, which is an ancient forest. And Liam was about 30 meters ahead of us on this trail. And a bear cub crossed from that side to that side in the woods. And as we approached the place where this cub had crossed, the mother bear growled. And there was this moment where two mothers realized that we were going to come and that somebody was going to come between them and their cub. And without any thought, Marlene, who was running marathons at that time, sprinted to her child as the bear went this way. And I stood for a moment and thought, wow, the power of a mother. Never get between a mother and their child. And Marlene would do anything for her child. She raised a wonderful young man. Liam became, an 18-year-old. He was smart. He was accomplished. He was kind. He cared about the natural world and people. And I know that Marlene would have done everything to save him. And pipeline executives and money failed her and failed the other families that lost their children that day. And ultimately, if you think about it, it is us who somewhat failed because we are the ones that are addicted to carbon. And I feel so lucky to be part of this community and to hear all these eloquent words that people are caring about the future, building a future, and thinking about how it is that our lifestyle connects to the natural world and sometimes creates great tragedy. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Dave Baker. I was a practicing neurosurgeon for 34 years here in Bellingham, currently retired. I had the honor of coaching Wade King, and I'd like to just relate a little story about him, because he was just a wonderful, wonderful kid, and I feel honored to have had a relationship with him as his baseball coach. We had a baseball team that had 7 and 8-year-olds, and Wade was 7, so he was younger than the other players. But Wade was very, very enthusiastic. He always had a smile on his face. He always hustled down to first base. He always lit up with funny anecdotes for the rest of the team to laugh at. And I remember at one practice, Wade was a little despondent and said, "Boy, I wish I had more playing time." I said, "Wade," I said, "we let you catch every practice because we want you to get better and better. You're 7 years old, and Eric is our first-string catcher. But remember, next year, you're going to be the man. You're going to be the guy. You're going to be the on-field coach that's going to direct your other players. You're going to be the leader on the field." And at that time, Wade's face lit up. He realized that he had a future for him, and that he was very enthusiastic after that during practice, telling the guys where to go, what position they need to be in. And I just want to relate how wonderful he was and how he touched me as a person. Thank you.
Don't leave for a second. I got to tell you another story. I'm Frank King. I'm Wade's dad. And I got to tell you another little story about Wade. I came home from work one day and Mary said that Wade had a game. And I guess he had done something wrong and Dave had chewed his rear. And he came home and his mother said, "Mom," now remember he's playing with 7 and 8 year olds. He said, his mother said, "Wade, Coach Baker really got on you." He said, you must feel really bad." And he said, "Mom, this is the big time." As a 7 and 8 year old. I just had to tell you that.
Can I say something real quickly? I can speak loud enough, I can tell you. My name is Barry Johnson. I am from West Virginia. I'm not from Bellingham, but I feel for you all. I'm here to represent the Appalachian region, dealing with what we think is a probably pretty unsafe pipeline. My friend Bill Limpers, who Bill knew very well, who passed away, created a group called the Pipeline Safety Group for our thing. What you all done, our region, I'm here, I traveled here for this. I did some other things like that on the West Coast, but I came here for this to tell you all how grateful we are for what you all did 25 years ago. What the Pipeline Safety Trust Group is doing every day. And so on behalf of the Appalachian region on the other side of the country, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maury. Yeah, we are doing this work every day all across the country, trying to make sure that we don't have to have a gathering like this in other communities 25 years from now. I really want to thank everyone for engaging in this dark, difficult chapter of Bellingham's history. I hope that those of you who were here feel the love and support of the community, and it's lifted you up on this difficult day. I hope that for those of us who weren't here, maybe the next time we're walking in Whatcom Falls Park and we see those signs and we're with somebody who also wasn't here, we have a story to share with them about what happened here 25 years ago. And I hope that we all have a bit of pride as a community of how you all and we all have responded to this loss and tragedy. To the family, friends, teachers, neighbors of Wade, Stephen, and Liam, as always, my heart goes out to you. And again, I hope you feel the love and support from the whole community. Thank you.